The book slipped from Eleanor Morgan's hands, hitting the polished oak floor with a thud that echoed through Millfield Public Library. Eleanor, 36 and cardigan-clad, stood frozen behind the reference desk, her heart hammering against her ribs. Across the reading room, Marine Captain Michael Reeves scanned the quiet space, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere like thunder. "I requested to speak with your demolitions consultant, not the book club coordinator. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The library fell silent. Even the perpetual hum of the ancient heating system seemed to pause. Eleanor's colleagues, Sophia, Daniel, and Lucia, suddenly found their computer screens fascinating. Nobody defended her. Nobody even looked her way. Director Patricia Wilson emerged from her office, her glasses perched nervously on her nose despite the air conditioning. "Captain Reeves, I apologize for any confusion. Perhaps I can help you locate whatever resource you're seeking. Our catalog system is quite extensive. Your advertisement states comprehensive resources for advanced engineering applications." Michael growled, his 3 marine companions forming an intimidating semicircle. "I see fiction sections and children's story hours." The word comprehensive hung in the air. Eleanor felt it burn, not because of her position, but because they assumed the library was just a repository of outdated encyclopedias rather than a modern information center. She had heard it before, countless times over the past 6 years in Millfield, but today something felt different. "I can help you," Eleanor said quietly. The library fell silent. She had never volunteered for specialized research requests, never challenged the established hierarchy. Her voice, barely above a whisper, somehow carried more weight than Michael's commanding tone. Sophia shifted uncomfortably. Daniel studied his computer monitor like it held the secrets of the universe. Lucia gripped her book cart tighter, her knuckles white. Ramirez, one of the Marines, stepped forward with theatrical disgust. "Look at this place. She's using the Dewey Decimal System. Probably Googled explosives this morning." Thompson, another Marine, laughed, a sharp sound that ricocheted off the bookshelves. "My daughter plays library too. Maybe they could have a play date." Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the reference desk. These weren't just any hands. Small scars crossed her palms. Her fingernails, kept short by necessity, bore traces of chemical stains, but she had learned to hide her expertise, to appear less knowledgeable than reality demanded. Survival in Millfield required invisibility. The structural stabilization. "Calculations you're using are outdated," she continued, her voice steady despite the mockery. "The 3D printed demolition caps will fail at pressure points you haven't accounted for in your blueprints." Michael stopped mid-insult. That level of assessment required either extraordinary luck or genuine expertise. She read that online. Thompson insisted, "Anyone can memorize terminology." "Then let anyone fix it," Eleanor replied, meeting Michael's skeptical gaze. "But when your controlled demolition fails during the operation, remember you had the chance to prevent it." Patricia grabbed her arm, not roughly but firmly. Fear radiated from her rather than anger. She needed community support. Offending Marines meant disaster for her small-town library. "Eleanor, return to your station now," she said. Eleanor looked at her boss, seeing the desperation in her eyes. The same desperation that had driven her to accept this job 6 years ago when she had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. "The explosive timing sequencer is already miscalibrated," she told Michael directly. "You have maybe 48 hours before your training exercise becomes a disaster, your choice." A blueprint on the table caught her eye, a mechanical error visible. From where she stood confirmed her diagnosis. Daniel whistled low. He had seen that same error before, always followed by extensive revisions. But admitting Eleanor's expertise meant acknowledging 6 years of dismissing her contributions. The social order of Millfield Public Library couldn't survive that revelation. As Eleanor retreated to the staff room, her hands shook. 6 years of silence. 6 years of accepting humiliation with grace. 6 years of pretending incompetence. To avoid conflict. All of it was crashing down because she couldn't watch precision demolition plans suffer for human prejudice. Her phone buzzed with a message from Camp Leoying, a number she hadn't seen in years. She deleted it without reading, but the damage was done. Memories she had buried deep began clawing their way to the surface. In her locker, beneath worn cardigans and a thermos that had seen better days, lay her personal notebook. Professional grade. Calculations that would impress most military engineers. She had brought them from North Carolina, unable to abandon the knowledge that felt like an extension of her soul. Wrapped in acid-free paper was a photograph. Her mother standing beside her at graduation, pride radiating from every angle. Her handwriting on the back remained legible despite years of handling. "My daughter, never let anyone define who you are. Talent speaks louder than words." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside, she heard the Marines arguing while her colleagues fumbled with research they didn't understand. The tension grew worse, men struggling against inevitable failure. Eleanor closed the locker, photograph still in her hand. Her mother wouldn't recognize the woman she had become, hiding talent to avoid conflict, accepting disrespect to maintain peace. But perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps dignity could be reclaimed, not through confrontation, but through undeniable demonstration. The blueprints fluttered again, the error glaring at anyone who knew what to look for. Eleanor made her decision. 3 days later, the tension in Millfield Public Library had thickened like old binding glue left too long in summer heat. Eleanor arrived early as always, but found the library buzzing with an energy that made her stomach clench. Word had spread about the Marine Corps' incident, and not in her favor. "Morning, Ellie," Daniel called out, but his usual friendly tone carried an edge. Sophia nodded tersely from behind the circulation desk. Only Lucia offered her customary warm smile, though even she seemed more cautious than usual. Patricia emerged from her office, clipboard in hand, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor, we need to talk." Her heart sank. The private conversation she had been dreading was finally here. "Look," Patricia began once they were alone in her cramped office, surrounded by grant applications and faded literary posters. "That thing with the military personnel, it's got people talking. Patrons are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" Eleanor asked, though she already knew. "About whether we're running a professional information center or some kind of—" She paused, searching for diplomatic words. "Training program for inexperienced librarians." The words stung because they were so far from the truth. Eleanor had been studying explosives since she could read, had earned her engineering degree with honors, had once led a team of 30 specialists at one of the military's most prestigious installations. But here in Millfield, her resume began and ended with book recommendations and computer assistance. "I helped them with their research," she said quietly. "Their plans are safer now than when they arrived." "That's not the point." Patricia's voice carried a frustration that wasn't entirely directed at her. "This is a small town, Eleanor. People talk. Mrs. Henderson heard from her nephew who works at the base that you supposedly embarrassed. Some Marines made them look foolish. I did my job. Your job is what I say it is." The words came out harsher than Patricia intended. She softened slightly, but the damage was done. "Look, I like you. You're reliable, punctual, and you don't cause trouble. But I've got a library to run. The community support alone keeps us afloat." Eleanor understood the unspoken message. Stay invisible or find another job. In Millfield, there weren't many options for a woman who worked with explosives. "I understand," she said, though the words tasted like metal in her mouth. "Good. I'm glad we're on the same page." Patricia stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Oh, and Eleanor?" "Captain Reeves is bringing his team back this afternoon. Some kind of follow-up research session. I want Daniel handling it personally." As Eleanor returned to the reference desk, she caught fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she appeared. Words like uppity and showing off floated through the air like toxic fumes. She had heard them before, in different contexts, in different cities, but they always carried the same message: know your place. Lucia approached her station as she began cataloging a new shipment of technical journals. "You okay, amiga?" she asked. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. Lucia was the only one who had ever treated her like an equal, the only one who seemed to see past the surface assumptions that defined her in this place. "That was impressive the other day," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "I've been working in technical libraries for 12 years, and I've never seen anyone identify a structural flaw that fast." "Just lucky," Eleanor deflected, but Lucia shook her head. "Nah, that wasn't luck. That was expertise, real expertise." She paused, studying Eleanor's face. "Where did you learn to understand demolition plans like that?" The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor had been waiting 6 years for someone to ask, to show genuine curiosity about her background. But now that the moment had arrived, she found herself paralyzed by the weight of explanation. "Around," she said finally. "You pick things up." Lucia nodded, accepting her evasion with grace. "Well, whoever taught you knew what they were doing. Those plans were completely revised when they left here." As if summoned by their conversation, the heavy tread of military boots filled the library. Through the glass doors, Eleanor saw Michael Reeves climbing the steps, his 3 companions following. Her stomach knotted as she recognized the set of his shoulders, the purposeful stride that had intimidated her before. "Daniel," Patricia called out, but her voice cracked with nervous energy. "Your VIP is here." Michael strode into the library like he owned it, his gaze sweeping over the various desks before settling on Eleanor. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she saw something there that hadn't been present during their first encounter. Uncertainty. "Ms. Wilson," Michael said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need to speak with whoever worked on our demolition plans." "That would be Daniel," Patricia replied quickly, gesturing toward the senior librarian. "He's our most experienced researcher." "No." Michael's interruption was sharp. "I need to speak with her." He pointed directly at Eleanor, the woman who made the assessment. The library fell silent again, but this time the quiet felt different, expectant, dangerous. Eleanor set down her cataloging tablet and walked toward the group, her heart pounding but her steps steady. She had learned long ago that showing fear only invited more predators. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice calm despite the chaos in her chest. Michael studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Our plans have been reviewed for 3 days now. Smooth operation, better than any we've developed in months." "Good," Eleanor replied, unsure where this was leading. "The thing is," Michael continued, "I've been thinking about what you said about the structural stabilization calculations, about the pressure points." He paused. "That's not common knowledge. That's specialized information." Eleanor remained silent, waiting. "So I made some calls, talked to some people." Michael's voice grew quieter, more intense. "People who know about advanced demolition systems, military specifications, the kind of technology that's not exactly available to your average small-town librarian." The blood drained from Eleanor's face. She had been so focused on fixing the error that she hadn't considered the implications of revealing her knowledge. In her old life, Such expertise would have been expected, even celebrated. Here, it made her a threat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but even to her own ears, the denial sounded weak. Michael smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We'll see about that." As the Marines left the library, Eleanor felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation, every sideways glance. She had tried so hard to remain invisible, to blend into the background of Millfield's literary landscape, but now, like it or not, she was very much visible. And visibility, she knew from bitter experience, was the first step toward destruction. The following week brought a spring chill that seemed to settle in Eleanor's bones. She arrived at the library each morning to find the atmosphere growing increasingly hostile. Patrons who had once nodded politely now avoided eye contact. Her colleagues' conversations died when she entered the break room. Even the book delivery drivers treated her with newfound suspicion. Patricia called her into the office on Thursday afternoon, her face grave. "I've got a problem, Eleanor," she began without preamble. "A big one." Eleanor sat in the worn chair, across from her desk, noting how Patricia couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Captain Reeves has been asking questions about you, about your background, about where you learned to work with military-grade demolition plans." Patricia's voice carried a tremor she'd never heard before. "He's got people looking into your history." Eleanor's mouth went dry. What kind of people? The kind that don't take mind-your-own-business for an answer. Patricia finally looked at her directly. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Is there anything in your past that could hurt this library? Anything at all?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Eleanor thought about her life before Millfield. The patents, the classified operations, the investigation that had destroyed everything she'd built, the NDAs she'd signed, the settlement agreements that had bought her silence in exchange for a chance to disappear. "Everyone has a past, Patricia." "That's not an answer." Her voice hardened. "I've got 2 kids in college, and this library is all I have. If there's something you're hiding—" "I'm not hiding anything illegal," Eleanor interrupted. "I've never been arrested, never been charged with anything. I pay my taxes and do my job." But she sighed, knowing that partial truth was better than outright lies. "I used to work for a military contractor in North Carolina. It didn't end well. I came here for a fresh start." "What kind of work?" "Demolition engineering, controlled detonation design. The kind of work that doesn't exist in Millfield." "Jesus, Eleanor." Patricia rubbed her temples. "Why didn't you tell me this before? Why take a job as a basic librarian when you could have been designing demolition systems?" "Because sometimes you need to disappear. Sometimes starting over means starting at the bottom." Before Patricia could respond, the library door chimed. Through the office window, Eleanor saw a black SUV pull into the parking lot. 2 men in suits emerged, their movements precise and professional. Government, she realized with a sinking heart. Or worse, private security. Ms. Wilson, the taller of the 2 men, approached the office. "I'm Agent Holloway, Naval Criminal. Investigative Service. This is Agent Becker. We'd like to speak with one of your employees." Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing that her carefully constructed anonymity was about to crumble. "Which employee?" Patricia asked, though her glance toward Eleanor made the answer obvious. "Eleanor Morgan. We understand she recently consulted on materials belonging to Captain Reeves." The next hour unfolded like a slow-motion train wreck. The agents were polite but thorough, asking questions about her qualifications, her assessment methods, her knowledge of military specifications. Eleanor answered carefully, sticking to facts while revealing as little as possible about her former life. "Ms. Morgan," Agent Holloway said finally, "our preliminary investigation suggests you have expertise that's unusual for someone in your current position. We're not accusing you of anything. But we need to understand how a small-town librarian knows classified information about military demolition systems. I don't know any classified information, Eleanor replied honestly. I identified a common problem using publicly available technical knowledge. The structural flaw you identified isn't common knowledge, Agent Becker interjected. It's a known vulnerability in that particular demolition sequence, but it's not something that would be obvious to most researchers. Eleanor felt trapped. Admitting her true background would invite scrutiny she couldn't afford, but continuing to deny her expertise would only make her look more suspicious. I read a lot, she said lamely. Technical manuals, engineering journals. I stay current with demolition technology. The agents exchanged glances. Agent Holloway pulled out a tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a lengthy document. According to our records, Eleanor Morgan has been employed at Millfield Public Library for 6 years. Before that, there's very little documentation of your existence. No employment history, no credit records, no significant digital footprint. That's unusual in today's world. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She had been so careful to build her new identity slowly, paying cash for everything, avoiding the kind of paper trail that would connect her to her former life. But apparently, that very caution had made her suspicious. I value my privacy, she said. Privacy is one thing, Agent Becker replied. But this level of anonymity requires significant effort, almost like someone was trying to hide from something. Patricia looked back and forth between Eleanor and the agents, her face pale. Gentlemen, I can vouch for Eleanor. She's been a model employee, never missed a day, never caused any trouble. We're not questioning her work ethic, Miss Wilson. We're trying to understand how she acquired knowledge that should be limited to military contractors and defense industry engineers. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Eleanor realized that her attempt to remain invisible had backfired spectacularly. By trying to hide her qualifications, she had only made herself more interesting to people who investigated anomalies for a living. I think, she said quietly, I need to make a phone call. The agents nodded. We'll wait. Eleanor stepped outside the library, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her contacts. She found the number she'd been avoiding for 6 years and pressed call. Westmoreland and Associates, came the crisp, professional voice. I need to speak with Sarah Westmoreland. Tell her it's Eleanor. Tell her it's about the Jenkins case. While she waited for her former lawyer to come on the line, Eleanor watched through the library windows as Daniel, Sophia, and Lucia pretended to work while obviously straining to hear the conversation with the federal agents. Patricia sat slumped in her chair, probably calculating how much a government investigation would cost her library. Eleanor. Sarah Westmoreland's voice was cautious but not unfriendly. I haven't heard from you in 6 years. I know, Sarah. I need help. Federal agents are asking questions about my background, and I can't tell them the truth without violating the settlement agreement. Slow down. What kind of federal agents? Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They think I might have access to classified information because I fixed a demolition plan. A long pause. Eleanor, the settlement agreement expired last month. You're free to discuss your background now. In fact, you should know the Jenkins case has been reopened. New evidence has come to light. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled. What kind of evidence? The kind that proves you were right all along. The kind that's going to make some very powerful people very unhappy. As she ended the call, Eleanor realized that her quiet life in Millfield was over. The past she'd tried so hard to escape was about to collide with the present she'd built, and she wasn't sure either would survive the impact. She walked back into the library, straightening her shoulders. If her anonymity was gone, then perhaps it was time to stop hiding. Gentlemen, she said to the agents, I think it's time we had a more detailed conversation. The conference room at the Millfield Police Department had seen better days. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the scarred table where Eleanor sat facing Agents Holloway and Becker. Patricia Wilson fidgeted in her chair beside her, her face pale with worry about what revelations might destroy her library. "Before we begin," Agent Holloway said, setting a digital recorder on the table, "I want to be clear that you're not under arrest or suspicion of wrongdoing. However, given the nature of the technology involved, we need to understand exactly who we're dealing with." Eleanor nodded, her hands folded calmly in her lap. After 6 years of hiding, the prospect of telling the truth felt both terrifying and liberating. "My name is Eleanor Morgan, but that wasn't always my name. Until 6 years ago, I was Dr. Eleanor Chambers, lead demolition engineer at Jenkins Defense Systems in North Carolina." Patricia's jaw dropped. Agent Becker leaned forward, suddenly more interested. "Dr. Chambers," Agent Holloway repeated, consulting his tablet. "I see, that explains a great deal. You know who she is?" Patricia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Chambers held 12 patents in advanced demolition engineering. By age 33, she designed the controlled detonation system that's currently used in 70% of military structural clearing operations. She is also the co-inventor of remote precision demolition technology. Before joining Jenkins Defense, she worked at DARPA as a senior research engineer. Eleanor felt a strange mix of pride and pain hearing her accomplishments recited like a resume. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long," Agent Becker interjected. "Your patents are still being used. Your demolition sequencing algorithm is literally implemented in the plans you reviewed. That's how you knew exactly what was wrong. You designed the evaluation system." Patricia stared at Eleanor as if seeing her for the first time. "You're that Dr. Chambers? The one who won the National Defense Innovation Award? I remember reading about you in Scientific American." "That was before everything fell apart," Eleanor said quietly. "What happened?" Agent Holloway asked, though. His tone suggested he already knew. Eleanor took a deep breath and began the story she'd never told anyone in Millfield. She spoke about Richard Jenkins, her former mentor, who had stolen her designs and claimed them as his own. About the lawsuit that had dragged on for 18 months while her reputation was systematically destroyed. About her mother's death. About the settlement agreement that had effectively banned her from the demolition engineering industry. "The legal fees consumed everything," she continued. "I lost my house, my savings, my career. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from discussing the case or claiming credit for my work. I was also banned from working for any major defense contractor for 6 years. That ban expired last month," Agent Becker observed. "Yes, but by then I'd built a different life. I thought I could stay hidden." Patricia found her voice. "Hidden? You've been working for me for 6 years, and you never thought to mention that you're one of the most brilliant demolition engineers in the country? Would you have hired me if I'd told you? A disgraced former executive with a history of military lawsuits? Or would you have assumed I was trouble?" Patricia fell silent, knowing she was right. Agent Holloway closed his tablet. "Dr. Chambers, we need to discuss your current situation. The Jenkins case has been reopened based on new evidence that corroborates your original claims. The FBI's White-Collar Crime Division has been building a case against Richard Jenkins for corporate espionage." Eleanor's heart skipped. "What kind of evidence?" "Digital forensics recovered from Jenkins's company servers. Email communications, file transfers, metadata that proves your designs were copied before he filed his patents. The evidence is comprehensive. More importantly," Agent Becker added, "the Department of Defense wants to discuss reinstating your security clearance. Your expertise is needed for several classified projects." The words hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Eleanor felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. "There's something else," Agent Holloway continued. "Captain Reeves's inquiry wasn't just about security concerns. He was impressed by your work. He's been advocating for your reinstatement, arguing that the military needs engineers who can identify problems in the field." "Michael Reeves defended me?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "He said, and I quote, 'Anyone who can spot a structural flaw in a demolition sequence with basic library resources while being harassed by a bunch of arrogant Marines is exactly the kind of person we need designing our systems.'" Patricia shook her head in amazement. 6 years. You've been here 6 years, and I had you organizing book clubs while you could have been designing the future of controlled demolition. "I wasn't ready for that life again," Eleanor admitted. "I needed time to heal, to figure out who I was without the corporate world defining me." "And now?" Agent Holloway asked. Eleanor looked around the stark conference room, thinking about the library where she'd spent 6 years rebuilding not just bookshelves, but herself. She thought about Lucia, the only person who had consistently treated her with respect. About the satisfaction of working with her mind, of solving problems without politics or corporate intrigue. "Now I know exactly who I am," she said firmly. "I'm an engineer who's learned the value of humility. I'm someone who can work with her hands and her mind. I'm a woman who won't be defined by other people's expectations or limitations." She paused, meeting each person's gaze. "I'm ready to reclaim my life." Agent Becker smiled. "Then let's talk about your future. The Pentagon has several projects that could use your expertise, and with your experience in both design and field assessment, you'd be invaluable." "What about Jenkins' defense?" Patricia asked. "Won't they want her back?" "Jenkins's board has extended multiple offers," Agent Holloway replied. "Full reinstatement, back pay, control of her own engineering division. They're desperate to rehabilitate their image after the scandal." Eleanor considered this. "And Richard Jenkins?" "He'll be arrested within the week. Federal charges of corporate espionage, patent fraud, and conspiracy. He's looking at significant prison time." For 6 years, Eleanor had dreamed of this moment. Vindication, justice, recognition of the truth. But now that it had arrived, she felt strangely detached from the desire for revenge. "I want to think about it," she said finally. "All of it, the Pentagon, Jenkins, everything. I've been making decisions based on fear for too long. I want to make this choice from a position of strength." "Of course," Agent Holloway said. "Standing, take your time." "But Dr. Chambers—" "Eleanor, don't take too long. The world needs engineers like you. The country needs people who can solve problems under pressure." As the agents gathered their materials, Patricia turned to Eleanor with a mixture of awe and regret. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I should have recognized your talent." "I should have. You gave me work when I needed it," Eleanor interrupted. "You gave me a place to heal. That's not something to apologize for. What happens now?" "To the library, I mean." Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in days. "Now you hire better researchers. You promote Lucia to senior librarian. She's got excellent instincts. And you remember that talent comes in all forms, not just the ones you expect." The news spread through Millfield like wildfire. Within hours of the federal agent's visit, everyone in town knew that the quiet librarian at Millfield Public Library was actually a renowned engineer who had been living in hiding. The story had everything the small town loved: mystery, government, intrigue, and the dramatic revelation that the woman they'd all underestimated was actually a genius. Eleanor arrived at work the next morning to find a crowd gathered outside the library. Local news vans occupied the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical flowers. Reporters thrust microphones at her as she tried to reach the front door. "Dr. Chambers, what's it like being vindicated after 6 years? Will you be returning to North Carolina? How does it feel to know your former mentor is facing federal charges? Eleanor pushed through the crowd without comment, but inside the library, she found even more chaos. The phone rang incessantly with calls from reporters, job recruiters, and former colleagues. Daniel and Sophia stood near the information desk, their faces mixing curiosity with something that looked like shame. "Morning, Dr. Chambers," Daniel said awkwardly, emphasizing her title. "It's still Eleanor," she replied, hanging up her coat. "Nothing's changed. Everything's changed," Sophia muttered. "We've been working next to a celebrity for 6 years and didn't know it." Lucia approached with a cup of coffee and a gentle smile. "How are you holding up, amiga?" "Better than expected," Eleanor admitted, "though I could do without the media circus." Patricia emerged from her office looking haggard. "Eleanor, I've had 23 calls this morning. 5 from major engineering companies, 7 from news outlets, and 11 from people wanting to know if we're hiring genius librarians. I'm sorry about the disruption. Don't apologize. I should be apologizing to you." Patricia's voice carried genuine remorse. "I've been thinking all night about how we treated you. How I treated you, making you organize community reads and process interlibrary loans when you could have been." "Patricia, stop." Eleanor's voice was firm but kind. "I needed those 6 years. I needed to remember that there's dignity in all work, that my value as a person wasn't tied to my professional reputation. Working here taught me that." Before Patricia could respond, the library door chimed. A woman in an expensive suit entered, her heels clicking authoritatively on the marble floor. Eleanor recognized her immediately. Victoria Jenkins, CEO of Jenkins Defense Systems. "Dr. Chambers," Victoria said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've been trying to reach you." The library fell silent. Even the reporters outside seemed to sense the importance of this moment. "Ms. Jenkins." Eleanor's voice was carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting you. I flew down as soon as I heard the news. We need to talk. I'm working right now. This is more important than—" Victoria paused, looking around the library with barely concealed disdain. "This is more important than whatever you're doing here." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Eleanor felt her colleagues stiffen, their eyes fixed on this exchange between two very different worlds. "My work is important," Eleanor said quietly. "All honest work is important." Victoria's expression softened slightly, as if she were dealing with a child having a tantrum. "Of course it is, but you're brilliant, Eleanor. You belong in research and development, not in some small-town library. 6 years ago, your company's board told me I belonged in court facing charges of intellectual theft. Now suddenly I belong in R&D again? That was different. We were misled by Richard's lies. But now we know the truth." "You knew the truth then," Eleanor replied, her voice growing stronger. "You just chose to believe the version that was more convenient for you." Victoria's mask slipped, revealing the calculating executive beneath. "Eleanor, be reasonable. We're prepared to offer you full reinstatement, your old salary plus 30%, and complete autonomy over your projects. You'd have your own laboratory, unlimited research budget, and a team of the best engineers in the industry. And in exchange? In exchange, you come home where you belong. You stop this, whatever this is." Victoria gestured around the library dismissively. "You resume your rightful place in the engineering world." Eleanor looked around the library, at Patricia, who had given her work when she was desperate, at Lucia, who had treated her with respect from day one, at Daniel and Sophia, who were finally beginning to understand what they'd witnessed, at the familiar books and catalogs that had been her companions through the darkest period of her life. "This is my home," she said simply. "These are my people." Victoria's smile became strained. "Eleanor, I understand you're emotional about this situation. It's natural to feel some loyalty to the place that sheltered you, But let's be practical. What future do you have here? What problems can you solve? What innovations can you create? I can teach, Eleanor said, the words coming to her as she spoke them. I can train the next generation of engineers to think critically. I can bridge the gap between theoretical knowledge and practical application. You want to waste your talents on engineering education? Victoria's voice rose with incredulity. I want to use my talents to make a difference. Real difference, not just corporate profits. Victoria's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Eleanor. The industry has a long memory. If you turn down this opportunity, there might not be another one. Is that a threat? It's reality. The defense world is smaller than you think. Reputation matters. Eleanor felt a familiar chill. The same intimidation tactics that had been used against her 6 years ago. But this time she wasn't alone. This time, she had people who believed in her worth beyond her ability to generate patents and profits. My reputation is my own to build, Eleanor said. And I choose to build it on integrity, not on bowing to corporate pressure. Lucia stepped forward, her voice steady. The lady said no. Maybe it's time you left. Victoria looked at her with undisguised contempt. I wasn't speaking to you. You're in our library, disrespecting our friend, Lucia replied. That makes it my business. Daniel and Sophia moved closer, their solidarity surprising even themselves. Patricia straightened behind the counter, her face resolute. I think, Patricia said quietly, you should leave, Miss Jenkins. Eleanor's made her position clear. Victoria's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. She wasn't accustomed to being dismissed by people she considered beneath her station. This is a mistake, Eleanor. A career-ending mistake. Then it's my mistake to make, Eleanor replied calmly. As Victoria turned to leave, she paused at the door. The Pentagon offer won't last forever either. They want results, not sentiment. When you're ready to be realistic about your future, you know where to find me. The door slammed behind her, leaving the library in stunned silence. Through the windows, they watched Victoria stride past the reporters without comment, her posture rigid with fury. Well, Daniel said finally, that was something. You okay? Lucia asked Eleanor, concern evident in her voice. Eleanor looked around at the faces surrounding her. Not colleagues, she realized, but friends. People who had stood up for her when it mattered, who had chosen loyalty over opportunity. I'm perfect, she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. The phone rang again, jarring everyone back to reality. Patricia answered with a weary sigh. Millfield Public Library. Yes, she's here. No, she's not giving interviews. Because she's working, that's why. As Patricia fielded another reporter's call, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Holloway. Pentagon meeting scheduled for Monday if you're interested. No pressure, but the offer stands. Your choice entirely. Eleanor stared at the message, weighing her options. The Pentagon represented everything she'd once dreamed of: prestigious work, unlimited resources, the chance to shape the future of military technology. It was the career she'd lost, offered back to her on a silver platter. But as she looked around the library, she realized that her dreams had evolved. 6 years ago, success meant recognition, awards, and cutting-edge research. Now success meant something different entirely. Lucia, she said suddenly, how would you feel about going back to school? Lucia looked puzzled. What kind of school? Engineering school. Part-time while you work. I could help you with the coursework. Lucia's eyes widened. You think I could do that? I think you have natural instincts that can't be taught. The rest is just mathematics and physics. We can handle that. What about Daniel and Sophia? Lucia asked. They've got experience too. Eleanor looked at the two librarians who were listening with growing interest. Anyone who wants to learn, we could start an education program. Here. Combine information science with engineering principles. Patricia hung up the phone, her expression thoughtful. You're talking about turning this place into some kind of training center? I'm talking about creating something new, a place where theoretical knowledge meets practical application, where people learn to think like engineers while working like information specialists. And you'd give up the Pentagon for this? Patricia asked, incredulous. Eleanor considered the question carefully. The Pentagon has thousands of brilliant engineers. They'll solve their problems with or without me, but here, I could make a difference that lasts generations. Her phone rang. Another unfamiliar number. She answered reluctantly. Dr. Chambers, this is Colonel Jennifer Matthews, Pentagon Engineering Division. I wanted to discuss the position we've offered. Colonel Matthews, I'm honored by the offer, but before you decide, let me explain what we're proposing. Others were measured in transformed lives and realized potential. She was beginning to understand which kind mattered more. 3 months later, the library had become something entirely unique in the American educational landscape, a hybrid facility where cutting-edge military technology met small-town values, where theoretical knowledge was tempered by practical wisdom, and where second chances bloomed into extraordinary achievements. Lucia had completed her associate degree with honors and was now enrolled in a full bachelor's program while working as Eleanor's lead assistant. Daniel had discovered a gift for computer modeling that impressed even veteran Pentagon engineers. Sophia had overcome her mathematical anxieties to become an expert in materials analysis. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. But success, Eleanor had learned, often attracted the wrong kind of attention. The challenge came from an unexpected source, Congresswoman Elizabeth Harper, whose district included Millfield. Harper had built her political career on opposing what she called government overreach and taxpayer waste. The Pentagon's partnership with the civilian library struck her as a perfect target for her next campaign. Ladies and gentlemen, Harper announced during a press conference on the steps of the county courthouse, we have a situation where the Department of Defense is spending millions of taxpayer dollars to subsidize a private institution. This is corporate welfare disguised as innovation. Eleanor watched the news coverage from the library break room, her stomach knotting with familiar anxiety. She'd faced political opposition before during the Jenkins lawsuit, and she knew how quickly public opinion could shift. This is different, Patricia assured her, though her voice carried uncertainty. People here know you. They've seen what you've accomplished. Politicians are skilled at making reality irrelevant, Eleanor replied, remembering how Richard Jenkins had twisted her reputation 6 years earlier. If Harper wants to make this about government waste instead of education and innovation, she might succeed. Her fears proved justified. Within days, Harper's supporters were questioning every aspect of the program. Local newspapers received anonymous tips about excessive government spending on unproven training methods. Social media campaigns portrayed Eleanor as a failed corporate executive living off taxpayer money. The attacks culminated in a public hearing where Harper demanded accountability for the program's costs and effectiveness. Eleanor knew this was her moment of truth, the chance to defend not just her work, but the dreams of everyone who had believed in the program's mission. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the front rows, their cameras focused on Eleanor as she sat at the witness table. Behind them, she could see the faces of people whose lives had been touched by the program, Lucia and her husband Matteo, Daniel with his teenage son, Sophia accompanied by her elderly mother, Patricia, and her family. Congresswoman Harper opened with her standard talking points about fiscal responsibility and government overreach. Her questions were designed to embarrass rather than illuminate, focusing on costs while ignoring benefits. Dr. Chambers, she said with theatrical concern, can you justify spending $3.2 million of taxpayer money to train librarians in a small town when that same money could fund veterans' benefits or infrastructure improvements? Eleanor had prepared for this question, but seeing Harper's smug expression triggered memories of similar interrogations during the Jenkins lawsuit. For a moment, she felt the familiar urge to retreat, to apologize for taking up space and resources. Then she looked past Harper to see Lucia in the audience, wearing the engineering excellence pin she'd earned after her groundbreaking research paper was accepted for publication. Beside her sat Daniel, whose digital modeling innovations had been adopted by 3 military branches. Sophia was there too, holding a certificate of commendation from the Secretary of Defense. "Congresswoman Harper," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment, "I can justify every penny, but more importantly, I can prove that those dollars have produced something invaluable, people who are prepared to serve their country with both skill and integrity." "Pretty words," Harper replied dismissively. "But what tangible results can you show? What measurable return on investment?" Eleanor stood, her movement drawing every eye in the courthouse. She had learned over 6 years of hiding and 3 months of rebuilding that some moments demanded presence rather than words. "Lucia Rodriguez," she called out. "Would you stand, please?" Lucia rose from her seat, her professional attire a stark contrast to the casual clothes she'd worn as a library assistant just months ago. 3 months ago, Lucia was processing interlibrary loans and organizing reference materials. Today, she's designing blast-resistant structures for military installations in conflict zones. Last week, her innovation saved the Pentagon $24 million in construction costs. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Harper's expression tightened. "Daniel Williams, please stand." Daniel rose awkwardly, still uncomfortable with public attention. Daniel spent 15 years believing he wasn't smart enough for anything beyond cataloging books. Last month, he identified a critical flaw in field fortification designs that could have cost lives in active deployment zones. His modeling method is now being taught at the Army Corps of Engineers' primary training facility. More murmurs. Louder now. Harper tried to interrupt, but Eleanor continued. "Sophia Patterson, please stand." Sophia stood with quiet dignity, her mother beaming beside her. Sophia discovered she had dyscalculia, which explained her struggles with traditional mathematics. When we adapted our teaching methods to her learning style, she revealed an extraordinary ability to understand complex material properties. She's now developing protective gear that will be used by every soldier deployed in the next decade. The courthouse had fallen completely silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. "Congresswoman Harper asked for measurable returns on investment," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "Here's what $2 million has produced. 3 people who went from managing library resources to designing the future of military safety. Innovations that will save hundreds of millions in construction and equipment costs. Training protocols that will be implemented nationwide. Most importantly, proof that talent exists everywhere if we're willing to invest in developing it." She paused, looking directly at Harper. "But there's something else that money has produced. Something that can't be measured in dollars or statistics. It's produced hope. Hope for people who thought their potential had already been determined by their circumstances." Eleanor gestured toward the audience where dozens of people had gathered to support the program. "Look around this room, Congresswoman. These are the faces of America's hidden potential. These are the people who will solve tomorrow's problems if we give them today's opportunities. Every dollar invested in their education and training returns tenfold in innovation, service, and national security." The silence stretched as Harper seemed to struggle for a response. Finally she managed, "That's very inspiring, Dr. Chambers. But inspiration doesn't justify taxpayer expenditure, doesn't it?" Eleanor asked quietly. "When inspiration produces innovation that saves lives and money, when it transforms underemployed workers into highly skilled engineers, when it proves that America's greatest resource isn't our technology or our military hardware, it's our people? She walked closer to Harper's table, her presence commanding the room's attention. You want to know about waste, Congresswoman? Waste is having brilliant minds catalog books for 20 years because nobody recognized their potential. Waste is losing lives because our equipment fails and we don't have enough skilled people to improve it. Waste is building walls between civilian and military communities instead of bridges that make us all stronger. Eleanor returned to her seat, but her voice carried clearly through the silent courthouse. This program doesn't waste taxpayer money. It multiplies it. Every dollar invested here produces engineers, innovations, and capabilities that didn't exist before. More importantly, it produces citizens who understand that their value isn't determined by their starting point, but by their willingness to grow. The hearing continued for another hour, but the tone had shifted completely. Harper's questions became increasingly defensive, while Eleanor's supporters provided testimony about the program's impact. Military officials presented data showing cost savings and efficiency improvements. Local business owners spoke about increased economic activity and community pride. When the hearing concluded, Eleanor felt cautiously optimistic. She had defended her work honestly and thoroughly, but political decisions weren't always based on facts or logic. That evening, as she organized files in the transformed library space after another busy day, her phone rang with a call from Colonel Matthews. Eleanor, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. Congresswoman Harper just announced that she's withdrawing her opposition to the program. More than that, she's requesting additional funding to expand it to other districts. Eleanor sank into a chair, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. What changed her mind? According to her staff, she spent the afternoon talking to Lucia, Daniel, and Sophia. Apparently, hearing their stories directly, not filtered through political rhetoric, made her understand what you've actually accomplished here. As Eleanor ended the call, she looked around the library that had become so much more than a workplace. It was a symbol of second chances, a proving ground for hidden potential, and a bridge between worlds that had once seemed incompatible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, and new opportunities to prove that talent could flourish anywhere if given the right support. But tonight she was content to savor a victory that had been won not through political maneuvering or corporate influence, but through the simple power of transformed lives and realized dreams. The final test hadn't been about defending a program. It had been about defending the belief that everyone deserved a chance to discover what they were capable of achieving. And that belief, Eleanor now knew, was worth fighting for. 1 year later, Eleanor stood before a gathering that would have been unimaginable when she first arrived in Millfield. The library had expanded into 3 connected buildings, housing classrooms, laboratories, and study spaces that buzzed with activity from dawn until well past sunset. The Millfield Institute for Applied Engineering had become a model studied by educators and military planners worldwide. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't in the buildings or equipment. It was in the people. Lucia Rodriguez adjusted her newly earned bachelor's degree hood as she prepared to address the graduating class of 32 students. As the Institute's first graduate to complete a full engineering program while maintaining her community ties, she had become a symbol of what was possible when opportunity met determination. 6 years ago, Lucia began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. I thought my ceiling was shelving books and answering reference questions. I never imagined standing here with an engineering degree, speaking to people who will design the future. In the audience, Eleanor felt tears threatening as she watched her first student embrace her potential fully. Beside her on the platform sat Daniel, now the Institute's head of digital modeling, and Sophia, who had overcome her learning challenges to become a specialist in materials science. The graduation ceremony represented more than individual achievements. It marked the maturation of an idea that had seemed impossible when Eleanor first proposed combining information science with engineering education in a small-town library. Captain Michael Reeves, now the Marines' liaison for civilian-military training partnerships, served as the keynote speaker. His presence symbolized how dramatically relationships could evolve when prejudice gave way to respect. When I first met Dr. Chambers, Michael told the gathered families and dignitaries, I made the mistake of judging her by my expectations rather than her capabilities. That mistake taught me something invaluable. The greatest threats to our national security aren't external enemies. They're internal assumptions that blind us to our own potential. He gestured toward the graduates who represented a diverse cross-section of backgrounds and ages. Former retail workers sat beside recent high school graduates. Veterans transitioning to civilian careers shared the stage with career changers seeking new challenges. These graduates prove that talent isn't distributed according to our preconceptions. It exists everywhere, waiting for someone brave enough to nurture it and patient enough to develop it. As Michael concluded his remarks, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The painful betrayal that had driven her from North Carolina now seemed like a necessary detour rather than a devastating defeat. Without that humiliation, she never would have discovered the satisfaction of building something new rather than simply advancing something existing. Her phone buzzed with a message from Victoria Jenkins. Congratulations on today's graduation. Offer to join Jenkins's board still stands. Your innovations are changing the industry. Eleanor deleted the message without responding, as she had done with similar offers from corporate executives and government officials who suddenly wanted to associate themselves with the Institute's success. She had learned that some victories were too important to risk on the ambitions of others. Professor Eleanor? She turned to find Mateo Rodriguez, Lucia's husband, holding their youngest daughter. Lucia wanted me to give you this. Mateo handed her a framed photograph showing the Institute's first day of operation. Eleanor barely recognized herself in the image. Tentative, defensive, still carrying the wounds of her corporate exile. Beside her stood Lucia, Daniel, and Sophia, their faces mixing hope with skepticism as they embarked on an uncertain experiment. She says this is where everything changed, Mateo continued, not just for her, but for all of us. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for celebration, Eleanor found herself standing alone on the small stage, looking out over the crowd of graduates, families, and supporters. The scene reminded her of countless corporate events she had attended in her former life, but the energy was completely different. Those events had been about competition and individual achievement. This celebration was about collaboration and community transformation. People weren't networking for personal advantage. They were sharing genuine joy in each other's success. Dr. Chambers? She turned to find Patricia approaching with a package wrapped in blue paper. Her library had evolved into the Institute's administrative headquarters, but she had retained her title as Director of Information Resources, a role that perfectly suited her blend of management skills and academic knowledge. The town council wanted me to give you this, Patricia said, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor unwrapped the package to reveal a crystal plaque bearing the key to the city and an inscription. To Dr. Eleanor Chambers, who taught us that the greatest strength is lifting others up. The ceremony's nice, Eleanor said, accepting the honor with genuine gratitude. But the real reward is watching people discover what they're capable of. Speaking of which, Patricia replied, I have some news. The Pentagon has approved funding for 7 additional institutes. They want to use our model in communities across the country. Eleanor felt the familiar mixture of pride and apprehension that accompanied every expansion opportunity. Growth was necessary for impact, but it also risked diluting the personal connections that made the Institute special. Who would run them? She asked. Graduates from our program. Lucia has agreed to establish the first one in Arizona. Daniel's interested in the Midwest location. Sophia wants to stay here and develop online training modules that can support all the institutes. The beauty of the plan struck Eleanor immediately. Rather than expanding through corporate acquisition or government mandate, the institute would grow organically through people who understood its mission from personal experience. As the celebration continued into the evening, Eleanor found herself walking through the original library where everything had begun. The space now served as a museum of sorts, preserving the books and study carols that had witnessed her transformation from exile to educator. Her mother's photograph sat on her old desk, the words as relevant now as they had been during her darkest moments. Never let anyone define who you are. Talent speaks louder than words. She traced the frame gently, thinking about how those words had guided her through betrayal, humiliation, and ultimately redemption. But the redemption hadn't come through vindication or revenge. It had come through discovering that her greatest talent wasn't designing demolition systems, but designing opportunities for others to discover their own potential. Eleanor? She turned to find Lucia standing in the doorway, her graduation gown still wrinkled from enthusiastic embraces. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." "You did the work," Eleanor replied. "I just provided the opportunity." "No," Lucia said, shaking her head. "You provided something more important than opportunity. You provided belief. You made me understand that my value wasn't determined by other people's expectations." As Lucia left to rejoin her celebration, Eleanor remained in the quiet library, surrounded by the books and memories that had reshaped her understanding of success, purpose, and fulfillment. 6 years ago, she had arrived in Millfield broken by betrayal and convinced that her career was over. Tonight she stood in the same spot as the founder of an educational movement that was transforming lives across the country. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to disappear, she had discovered her true calling. In accepting what seemed like failure, she had found a success more meaningful than any corporate achievement. Her phone buzzed one final time with a message from an unknown number. "Dr. Chambers, I'm a single father in Kansas whose daughter loves explosions, but doesn't think engineering is for her. I heard about your institute on the news. Is there hope for someone like her?" Eleanor smiled as she typed her response. "There's always hope. Talent exists everywhere. Sometimes it just needs the right environment to flourish. Let's talk about making her dreams possible." As she turned off the lights and locked the library, Eleanor reflected on the question that had haunted her since the day Captain Reeves first challenged her competence. If you found yourself dismissed and underestimated, would you speak up immediately or let your actions do the talking? She had learned that the answer wasn't either or. Sometimes dignity required silence while you built strength. Sometimes justice demanded speaking truth to power. But always, always the most powerful response was creating opportunities for others to discover their own voices. The drive home took her past the welcome sign that still proudly declared Millfield's population and founding date. But the town she was leaving that night was fundamentally different from the one she had discovered 6 years earlier, not because of buildings or businesses, but because of transformed perspectives and expanded possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that potential existed everywhere if people were brave enough to nurture it. Eleanor drove through the quiet streets of her adopted hometown, finally understanding that home wasn't where you came from. It was where you chose to build something lasting. And what she had built in Millfield would last for generations, carried forward by people who had learned that their worth wasn't determined by their starting point, but by their willingness to lift others as they climbed. In the end, that lesson proved more valuable than any patent, more powerful than any corporate position, and more lasting than any individual achievement. Some victories weren't measured in profits or recognition. They were measured in transformed lives and realized dreams. And those, Eleanor had discovered, were the only victories that truly mattered. 5 years after the founding of the Millfield Institute, Eleanor sat in her sunlit office overlooking the central courtyard where students gathered between classes. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect her identity had blossomed into a national network of 14 institutes, each dedicated to discovering untapped talent in unexpected places. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. Sophia entered, carrying a tablet displaying the latest enrollment statistics. "The numbers from the new Denver facility are incredible," she said, handing the tablet to Eleanor. "Applications are double what we projected." Eleanor scanned the data, noting with satisfaction the diversity of applicants: veterans, former retail workers, retired teachers, recent immigrants. People society had either overlooked or undervalued, all seeking the chance to reinvent themselves. "What's more impressive," Sophia continued, "is the retention rate. 97% of students complete the program. That's unheard of in accelerated technical education. People don't quit when they finally find what they're meant to do," Eleanor replied, returning the tablet. "When did you know?" "Know what? That materials science was your calling." Sophia smiled, remembering. "The day you showed me how to visualize molecular structures instead of trying to understand them through equations. You adapted to how my brain works instead of trying to force my brain to adapt to traditional methods." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. Captain, now Major, Michael Reeves stood in the doorway, his uniform crisp but his expression troubled. "Major," Eleanor greeted him. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow's budget meeting." "This couldn't wait," he replied, glancing at Sophia. "Do you mind if we speak privately?" After Sophia left, Michael closed the door and sat heavily in the chair across from Eleanor. "The Department of Defense is facing cuts," he said without preamble. "Significant ones." Eleanor felt a cold knot form in her stomach. How significant? 30% across non-essential programs, and the institutes qualify as non-essential? Michael nodded grimly. "The new administration considers them educational enrichment rather than core defense infrastructure." Eleanor took a deep breath, absorbing the blow. Government funding constituted nearly half of the institute's operational budget. A 30% cut would devastate programs they'd spent years building. "How long do we have?" "The Budget Committee votes next month. Without intervention, the cuts take effect 90 days later." "Intervention like what?" "You," Michael said simply. "You need to testify before the committee. They need to understand what they're cutting isn't just an educational experiment. It's a national security asset." Eleanor shook her head. "You know how I feel about Washington politics. I do. But I also know what these institutes mean to people like Lucia, Daniel, and thousands of others. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in the field, but in hearing rooms." His words hung in the air between them, a challenge Eleanor had hoped never to face again. Her appearances before Congresswoman Harper had been painful enough. The thought of facing an entire committee in Washington made her throat tighten. "I'll think about it," she said finally. After Michael left, Eleanor walked through the Institute's halls, observing classes in session. In one laboratory, Daniel guided students through advanced structural modeling. In another, a former grocery store manager demonstrated a breakthrough technique for explosive containment that she'd developed just 3 months into the program. These were the stakes. Not buildings or budgets, but human potential on the verge of realization. Could she risk their futures because of her own aversion to political battles? That evening, as Eleanor reviewed funding alternatives in her modest home on the outskirts of Millfield, her doorbell rang. She opened it to find an unexpected visitor, Congresswoman Elizabeth Harper, the woman who had once tried to dismantle everything Eleanor had built. "May I come in?" Harper asked, her tone far more subdued than during their courthouse confrontation. Years earlier, Eleanor hesitated, then stepped aside. I'm sure you've heard about the proposed budget cuts, Harper said as they sat in Eleanor's living room. Major Reeves informed me this morning. What he may not have told you is that I now on the budget committee. Eleanor studied the Congresswoman carefully. And you're here to what? Gloat? Apologize? Offer a compromise? I'm here to help, Harper replied. I was wrong about the institutes, Eleanor. What you've created isn't government waste. It's one of the most efficient investments in human capital I've ever seen. People aren't capital, Eleanor said sharply. No, they're more valuable than capital. That's what I've come to understand. But the committee doesn't see it that way. They see line items and overhead costs. They see facilities that don't produce immediate military hardware. What do you suggest? Bring your graduates, all of them. Fill the hearing room with living proof of what these institutes accomplish. Make it impossible for the committee to view this as an abstract budget decision. Eleanor shook her head. These people have jobs, families. I can't ask them to drop everything for a political stunt. It's not a stunt if it's real, Harper countered. And from what I've seen of your graduates, they understand the value of what they've received. They'll come. After Harper left, Eleanor sat in silence, weighing the Congresswoman's advice against her own instincts. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucia. Heard about the budget situation. Denver Institute standing by. Just say the word. Similar messages followed from Daniel, Sophia, and directors of other institutes across the country. Somehow word had already spread, and her extended family of transformed lives was rallying without being asked. Eleanor made her decision. The congressional hearing room was indeed filled to capacity 3 weeks later. Eleanor had expected perhaps 50 graduates to attend. Instead, nearly 300 had come, taking personal days, arranging childcare, driving through the night, flying across country, all to support the program that had changed their trajectories. As Eleanor approached the witness table, she felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her previous political confrontations. This time she wasn't alone. This time, she carried the collective strength of hundreds of stories, each one a testament to what became possible when talent met opportunity. Dr. Chambers, began Senator William Matthews, committee chairman, were facing difficult budgetary decisions. Your institutes consume significant resources that could be directed toward more immediate defense priorities. Why should we continue funding what appears to be primarily an educational initiative? Eleanor leaned toward the microphone. Senator, I could present statistics demonstrating the cost-effectiveness of our programs. I could show you patents developed by our graduates that have saved the military billions. I could calculate the return on investment in precise dollars and cents. She paused, looking around the packed room. But instead, I'd like to introduce you to what those numbers represent. Actual people whose lives and contributions would never have existed without these institutes. For the next hour, graduate after graduate approached the microphone. A former janitor who now designed blast-resistant structures that had saved lives in 3 conflict zones. A single mother who had developed a new ceramic armor while studying nights after her children were asleep. A veteran whose PTSD had made traditional education impossible, but who had thrived in the Institute's adaptive learning environment. Eleanor watched the committee members' expressions shift from polite attention to genuine engagement as the human impact of their budgetary decisions became impossible to ignore. These stories are compelling, Senator Matthews acknowledged when the testimonials concluded. But the fundamental question remains, is this the Department of Defense's responsibility? Shouldn't education fall under other agencies? With respect, Senator, Eleanor replied, these aren't just educational facilities. They're national security incubators. The traditional defense contractor model draws from a tiny pool of elite universities and established professionals. Our institutes tap talent that would otherwise never enter the defense sector. And why is that diversity so important? Because innovation doesn't come from uniformity, Eleanor said, her voice strengthening. The most challenging problems require perspectives shaped by different life experiences. A former grocery manager approaches explosive containment differently than someone who's only known laboratory conditions. A single mother finds efficiencies in manufacturing processes that escaped traditional engineers. She gestured toward the filled gallery. Every person in this room represents a perspective, a problem-solving approach that wouldn't exist in your defense infrastructure without these institutes. Cut our funding, and you don't just lose buildings or programs. You lose entire categories of solutions you'll never even know you needed. The committee's questions continued for another 2 hours, probing the Institute's finances, metrics, and outcomes. Eleanor answered with a confidence born not from personal pride, but from absolute certainty in the value of what they had built. As the hearing concluded, Senator Matthews made an unusual announcement. In light of today's testimony, this committee will delay its final recommendation pending a series of site visits to the institutes in question. We need to see these facilities in operation before making such a consequential decision. It wasn't victory, but it was opportunity, exactly what Eleanor had always fought to provide. Outside the hearing room, Eleanor found herself surrounded by graduates expressing gratitude and determination. One voice rose above the others, familiar yet unexpected: Dr. Chambers. The crowd parted to reveal Richard Jenkins, her former mentor and adversary, now a shell of his former commanding presence after years of legal battles and imprisonment. Mr. Jenkins, Eleanor acknowledged, her voice neutral. I watched the hearing on television, he said, his voice quieter than she remembered. What you've built, it's remarkable. Thank you, she replied, unsure what more to say to the man who had once tried to destroy her career. I won't ask for forgiveness, Jenkins continued. What I did was unforgivable. But I wanted you to know that even from my lowest point, I can recognize genuine achievement. You've created something I never could have imagined, let alone built. Before Eleanor could respond, Jenkins handed her a sealed envelope. My testimony. For the committee, if it would help. My perspective on why your approach succeeds where traditional defense contractors fail. The gesture, unexpected, unnecessary, yet profound, left Eleanor momentarily speechless. The man who had stolen. Her work now offered his words in her defense, not because it benefited him, but because he recognized something authentic. I'll make sure they receive it, she said finally. As Jenkins walked away, Eleanor felt the last weight of her past lifting. She had spent years defining herself partly in opposition to what had been taken from her. Now even that negative reference point had been resolved. She was free to be entirely who she had become, without shadows from who she had been. The committee's site visits began the following week, with senators and staff members touring institutes across the country. Eleanor accompanied them to the Denver facility, where Lucia proudly demonstrated student projects that were already being implemented by military engineering units. What impresses me most, remarked Senator Matthews as they observed a classroom where students of all ages collaborated on a bridge reinforcement challenge, is the atmosphere. I've visited dozens of technical training facilities, and they never feel like this. Like what? Eleanor asked. Joyful, he replied. These people aren't just learning skills. They're discovering themselves. That's exactly what we're trying to create, Eleanor said. Technical expertise without human development is just training. We're building whole engineers, people who understand not just how to solve problems, but why those solutions matter. By the time the committee concluded its tour of all 14 institutes, the political calculation had fundamentally shifted. Cutting funding to facilities that were visibly transforming lives and legislators, home districts had become politically unpalatable. More importantly, the strategic value of the Institute's approach had become undeniable even to the most skeptical committee members. When the budget was finally approved, the institutes not only retained their funding, but received a modest increase earmarked for expanding their reach into rural communities where technical education options were most limited. I never thought I'd see the day when politicians actually increased funding for something worthwhile, Michael remarked as they reviewed the final budget numbers in Eleanor's office. It wasn't about politics in the end, Eleanor replied. It was about making the human impact impossible to ignore. Speaking of impact, Michael said, sliding a folder across her desk. The Pentagon has a proposal for you. They want to adapt the Institute's model for diplomatic purposes, building similar facilities in allied nations to strengthen security partnerships through shared innovation. Eleanor opened the folder, scanning the proposal. They want me to oversee international expansion? Starting with 3 countries, South Korea, Germany, and Kenya. Each location selected for strategic importance and untapped technical potential. The opportunity was extraordinary, a chance to translate what they'd learned in small-town America to communities around the world. But it would mean leaving Millfield, the place that had sheltered her when she needed it most. I need to think about it, she said, closing the folder. That evening, Eleanor called a meeting of the original team, Lucia, Daniel, Sophia, and Patricia, gathering them in the library where everything had begun. The Pentagon wants to take our model international, she explained after sharing the details. It's an incredible opportunity, but it would mean significant changes. I wanted your honest input before making any decisions. You should do it, Lucia said immediately. What we've built here is too important to limit to one country. But what about Millfield? Eleanor asked. This is where it all started. Patricia smiled gently. Eleanor, you've spent years teaching people not to be defined by their starting points. Maybe it's time you took your own advice. Besides, Daniel added, it's not like you'd be abandoning what we've built. We'd continue running things here while you establish the international framework. You've trained us well, Sophia agreed. Maybe too well. We're ready to fly on our own. Eleanor looked around at the faces of people who had begun as colleagues and become family. When did you all get so wise? We had a good teacher, Lucia replied. 3 months later, Eleanor stood in a converted warehouse in Seoul, South Korea, watching as local engineers and international advisors prepared for the opening of the first International Institute for Applied Engineering. The space hummed with the same energy she had first fostered in Millfield, the electric anticipation of potential about to be realized. Her phone buzzed with a video call from Millfield. She answered to find Lucia, Daniel, Sophia, and Patricia crowded around the screen, the familiar library visible behind them. How's it going? Lucia asked. Chaotic, inspiring, terrifying, exactly as it should be, Eleanor replied, turning her camera to show the activity around her. How are things there? We just received acceptance letters from 120 new students for the fall term, Patricia reported proudly. Largest class yet. And remember that single father from Kansas? Daniel added. His daughter just won the National Young Engineers Competition with her controlled demolition design. The one who didn't think engineering was for girls? Eleanor asked, smiling at the memory of the text message that had arrived on graduation night years ago. The very same, Sophia confirmed. She's starting at the Denver Institute next month. The conversation continued for several minutes, updates flowing in both directions, evidence of momentum continuing without Eleanor's direct presence. As they said their goodbyes, Eleanor felt not loss but profound satisfaction. The true measure of leadership wasn't creating dependency, but fostering independence. A young Korean woman approached as Eleanor ended the call. Dr. Chambers, the local community representatives have arrived. They're quite skeptical about our program. What are their concerns? Eleanor asked as they walked toward the meeting room. They don't believe we're serious about including people without formal education. They think this is just another elite program with international branding. Eleanor nodded, familiar with the skepticism. Then let's show them exactly who we are. The meeting room contained a dozen community leaders, their expressions ranging from polite interest to outright suspicion. Eleanor had faced similar rooms in small towns across America, and now she would face them around the world. "Thank you for coming," she began, dispensing with formality. "I understand you have concerns about our commitment to your community. Rather than making promises, let me tell you a story that began in a small-town library." As Eleanor spoke, she watched recognition dawn in the eyes of her audience, the universal human experience of being underestimated, of having potential that others failed to see. By the time she finished describing what had grown from those humble beginnings, the atmosphere in the room had transformed from skepticism to cautious hope. "We're not here to tell you what your community needs," she concluded. "We're here to create a space where people who have been told they don't belong in engineering can discover their own capabilities. The rest will follow naturally." An elderly community leader raised his hand. "And what happens when you leave, when the American military loses interest in our region?" It was the same question Eleanor had faced in Millfield years ago, the fear that opportunity was temporary, dependent on the whims of those with power. "From day one, we'll be training local directors," she explained. "This institute will belong to your community, run by your people. Our role is to help you build something lasting, not to control it." As the meeting concluded, several community leaders lingered to continue the conversation, their initial resistance melting into engaged planning. The pattern was familiar. The same human dynamics played out across cultural and language barriers. People everywhere needed the same fundamental elements: respect, opportunity, and the chance to contribute meaningfully. Later that night, Eleanor stood on the rooftop of her temporary apartment, looking out over the Seoul skyline. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. "Dr. Chambers, this is Jae-hee Kim from today's meeting. My niece has always been fascinated by building demolition, but our family could never afford engineering school. Would your program consider someone like her?" Eleanor smiled as she typed her response. "Your niece is exactly who we're looking for. Talent exists everywhere, across every border and barrier. Sometimes it just needs the right environment to flourish." As she sent the message, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from hiding in a small town library to launching an international movement. The question that had defined her life had evolved from "how do I protect myself?" to "how do I protect others' potential?" The most powerful answer, she had discovered, wasn't found in demolition formulas or engineering principles. It was found in the courage to see possibility where others saw limitations, in the commitment to create opportunities that outlasted any individual career, in the wisdom to understand that true leadership meant working yourself out of a job by building capacity in others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in this unfamiliar country: language barriers, cultural differences, institutional resistance. But the fundamental truth that had guided her work remained constant. When people are given the tools, training, and trust to develop their gifts, they inevitably surprise those who underestimated them, including, often, themselves. Eleanor took one last look at the glittering city before turning toward her apartment. Her mother's photograph sat on her nightstand, the handwritten message now faded but still legible. "Never let anyone define who you are. Talent speaks louder than words." Those words had once been her shield against a world that sought to diminish her. Now they were the foundation of an approach that had transformed thousands of lives across continents. Not because she was exceptional, but because she had learned to recognize the exceptional potential in others. As she drifted to sleep, Eleanor's thoughts returned to that first confrontation in the library, when Marine Captain Michael Reeves had dismissed her as just a librarian. How could he have known? How could anyone have known? that his misjudgment would spark a movement that would eventually circle the globe. Perhaps that was the final lesson her journey had taught her. The most profound transformations often begin with someone underestimating the wrong person at exactly the right moment. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.